All right, am I on the screen? Hi there. I know Ingrid is joining us. Do we have anyone else yet, Kathy? Not yet. Well, hello and welcome to all of you. In person, we have a clipboard coming around. If you want to add your name and email, then some of the action points and organizations that I talk about tonight will be emailed to you after the fact. And also, if you are online with us, you can drop that in the chat and just drop your name and email in the chat if you would like to receive that. Do I need to talk louder in person? You can hear me in the back? Okay. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening and having this session together. Just a little bit about me. I'm Marissa Sukester. I'm our Director of Faith Formation here at Christ the Servant. And this topic of refugees and immigrants is especially close to my heart. My dad is a Cuban exile, and that's just part of my family's story. And so it's something that's really been part of who I am and my family. And so I'm excited about sharing some things. I am not specifically an expert. I've done a lot of research, but I understand that other people have many other insights that they're bringing to the table. So I value and appreciate that. And if I don't know the answer to anything, we will find out. I can email that out when I reply to all of you. If you're on Zoom, Kathy Whirling-Smith is managing your interaction with us. And so yeah, if you can funnel any comments or questions through the chat, she'll help represent you in this space. We also have a microphone so that our friends online can hear us. So if you're speaking, even if we're in person, you won't hear the amplification here, but you can use the microphone so that our friends online can interface the best way with us. If you need to use the restroom, it's down the hall. They're being painted, but they're functional and I believe dry at this point. So, okay, so we'll go ahead and yeah. All right, welcome. We've got, who else do we have? All right. Excellent. Thank you for joining us. You won't be able to see these people, but we're gonna go around and do a quick introduction of people in person. And you can share, so if you're online, you can type this in the chat and then Kathy will represent you. But what brought you here today? What are you interested in or why are you here, as well as your name?
I'm Sue Whitmer, and I have worked with some other organizations around caring about refugees. And I have been part of your community online through COVID. And I just saw it advertised and thought I would come and hear what you have to say and what is happening here.
I'm Lou Nelson. I'm a member of Christ the Servant. I am just interested in this whole topic, and I hope to be able to use some of my expertise in areas that might be of need.
I'm Megan Patnott, and I missed all of the directions except for say your name.
Just what brought you here? Like, okay. Why are you here to learn about this topic?
I was arriving right as that was said. It sounds that's not uninteresting to me. I don't have a huge connection. I'm honestly just trying to get myself used to like leaving my house and talking to people. I'm like, well, this sounds interesting. This sounds like also a good reason to make myself leave my house.
Yeah, well, we're glad of that.
My name is Beth Ward, and I'm here to learn more about how I can help Afghan refugees who are resettling in this area.
My name is Becky Kay, and I'm here also to help refugees and find out how to serve them.
And Kathy, you get to be yourself and communicate for our other friends.
And then I'm Kathy Whirling-Smith, and I'm on the outreach committee, and so I am here to help and excited to see My mom was involved with Hmong refugees when we were young back in Iowa. And so it'll be neat to see what we can do to support people that need it now.
And then would you just share, if anyone shared via the computer?
Oh, yes. Oh, wow. Ingrid Lewis comes from a refugee family. Her parents were sponsored from a church in South Dakota. And Anne Marie and Mary, you know, they're just indicating they want email. So that's it. Thank you, Ingrid.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. It'll just stay on. So a couple of things. We're also going to do, if you could take 2 of these, that would be awesome. I guess I could have done this with our introductions, but take 2. And then, hi, Joel. Hi, Caitlin. Welcome. Could you type these?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I don't know how to do this. I should have. If you could just say, like, assign them each one of these. We can try. How are your speakers on your computer?
I don't know if they're working.
Okay.
Well, actually, I couldn't mute it, so I
Oh, right. It would make feedback. Okay. All right. Our online friends, we're still always learning how to make this the best experience for you possible. So, especially in a hybrid situation. So, I'm sorry that we don't have an audio feed from you without creating sound interference in our space. But we'll keep learning and trying. What we'll do now is, and Kathy, you can start us off. We're just going to share a few lines from scripture that'll help orient us in this topic. So if you would start with yours and then pass the mic, that would be wonderful.
And I'm just reading the main verse from Leviticus 25:35. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they may continue to live among you.
Do you yeah, go ahead and do both of yours
Right.
and then.
Malachi 3, verse 5. So I will come to put you on trial. I will be quick to testify against sorcerers, adulterers, and perjurers, against those who defraud laborers of their wage, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and deprive the foreigners among you of justice. But do not fear me, says the Lord Almighty.
This is from Leviticus 23:22. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. And from Leviticus 24:22, you are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God.
From Exodus chapter 12, verse 49. The same law applies to both the native born and the foreigner residing among you. From Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 19. Cursed is anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Then all the people shall say, Amen.
Matthew 25, verse 35. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Jeremiah 5 through 7. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow the other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever.
Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 to 34. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be trusted as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
Psalm 146:9. The Lord watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow, but he frustrates the way of the wicked. Zechariah 7:9-10. This is what the Lord Almighty said. Administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other.
So we can see from these scripture verses that God is pretty direct around expectations for us as people of God. And I have a few others that I want to share in a slightly different theme. Exodus 22:21, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Exodus 23:9, do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. Deuteronomy 10:18-19, God defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So you can see these themes repeating themselves over and over again throughout Scripture, both directing us as people of God to love and care for the foreigner, especially, and we heard other groups that are marginalized as well throughout history and now as well, that these are commands given to us. I appreciate some of the verses, how your verse said, I am the Lord your God. There's like this extra oomph there, right? And the people said, Amen. And then this recalling of our own history. And for us, whether it's our actual ancestors or our scriptural ancestors, remembering that that's an experience of those people. And I know Ingrid shared and I shared, and that our families are very closely connected as refugee families. Or descendants of refugees. But also, as we're gathered here in a Lutheran church, I thought I'd share a little bit about Lutheran history, because some of you may have heard about Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services. Have you heard of that organization? And they are actually one of the most influential non-government organizations that support resettlement of refugees in the whole country, and represent these issues to Congress and things like that, and advocate for change at that federal level as well. But there's a reason that Lutherans are really showing up in this area, and that's because American Lutherans have that history. And so actually folks started coming in the 1600s, as early as then, and because there were not networks back in the 16 and 1700s, they were welcomed and allowed to enter, but there were not systems of support. And so they started to create that system for their local community and structures to support their community, and then started supporting other folks that came over. With the history of LIRS, they really got their start about 80 years ago. But in the 1800s, there was large waves of German Lutherans who were seeking religious freedom, and that actually is the start of the Missouri Synod part of the Lutheran Church. And then in the 1850s and 70s, there were further large waves of Lutheran immigrants from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and diversifying their places of origin. And then continuing into the 1900s, after the First World War, there was a group, and that's the history, the precursor to LIRS, resettled 522 Lutheran immigrants specifically, and after World War II, that increased to 30,000 refugees from Germany and Eastern Europe. And so their support, that organization's support, has really especially continued at the critical waves of mass groups of refugees coming across then the 1900s and into the 2000s, including waves of immigrants from Hungary, from Cuba. So that's a little connection for me. Vietnam refugees, and right now, continuing up until this current crisis with Afghans trying to resettle in the United States. So that's just a little bit of a connection, whether your personal family story is that way, or we're connecting to our scriptural ancestors, or we're connecting to the history of the Lutheran Church. We're all somehow or another can draw on sources of empathy and connection, even if that's not our immediate experience, that allows us to seek support and feel that call to action to help the foreigner among us. So we'll take a little bit of time and talk about some key terms you might hear and the differences between them. But I also welcome you to chime in with questions or contributions. Like I said, I have done a lot of research and I have my own history and my own passion around this topic, but I am not formally trained or an expert or representing another organization besides CTS. So refugee versus asylum seeker. Does anybody know what those groups have in common? This is not a quiz. I didn't teach you this, so it's not really fair. But Sue, you wanna shout out, share what you know?
They're both groups of people that have come from another country seeking protection of some sort from a racial or religious or political or social group, and there's a fifth one, I forget. And asylum seekers are people that have already been in the United States and they're petitioning our government for protection. And refugees are being relocated and possibly will come to our country, and they seek protection, I think, from the United Nations, and but both are international protection from wherever it is that they left.
Mm-hmm.
And can seek what they have to become a refugee, is that right? That in order to seek a green card and have permanent residency in the United States, that's sort of the progression.
Yeah,
And
so
they have to qualify under one of those reasons for leaving and claiming that title.
yes, so they have really core similarities in common in terms of why are folks fleeing their countries? They're being persecuted, their safety's at risk. A lot of times it has to do with your core identity, who you are, your political affiliation, race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, things like that, that are causing you to be in the line of harm in your home country. And the core difference is really, like you were saying, a processing difference. So, and these are also international designations that everyone has the right to seek asylum somewhere else. So sometimes you'll hear rhetoric around things, but it is a human right to try to migrate and gain safe haven somewhere else. So refugees, as you said, are processed before they're permitted to enter into the country. So many people who, if we talk about current events, who have been evacuated from Afghanistan are somewhere typically nearby, and the process for applying for refugees status typically can take 18 to 24 months. Plus, then once you're approved, you go through additional screenings before you're permitted entry into the country that is hosting you. After 1 year, you're permitted to apply for and must apply for your green card or legal residency status. You are able to work and access some means of healthcare and education, but you're in this kind of tenuous situation where you're, despite having probably waited more than a year to even get into the country. So that's when you hear about like refugee camps that pop up places. People have fled their home nation, but are not yet permitted to enter formally into another nation. And those are typically in the surrounding nations from wherever they are fleeing. And then an asylum seeker applies for that status at a port of entry. So you've heard probably, especially along the southern border, people were being denied their not permitted to apply for asylum at the southern border in the past few years. But that's actually an international human right to apply for asylum. And you have to apply for asylum when you're already in that country. So you can do it at a port of entry, or perhaps you've entered with some other legal status and then are applying for asylee status. If you're an asylum seeker, you have to wait a whole year, even though you're in the country already, before you can work legally or do anything like that. And I believe in my notes, I had that you have to wait 5 years before you could start any sort of process to become a legal citizen. How many of you have heard the SIV, special immigrant visa status floating around with regard to Afghan folks who are fleeing? Has anybody heard that? So that's really, really given specific designation. There's talk of like trying to process those things more quickly, or that before the US pulled out of Afghanistan, we should have been processing those more quickly. That really, in that situation, is given to translators and interpreters who were working with the US military in Afghanistan. And so thus, by association, they even were on, I've heard some stories in the news, right, where folks in the military from the US are trying to advocate on behalf of their friends who were on all their missions with them, interpreting constantly, because they couldn't do their missions without communication. And so if someone were in that situation, they could apply for a special immigrant visa, which could allow them to enter more quickly or be processed more quickly or have a different designation. There's also something called humanitarian parole that is sometimes granted. So there's also right now let me make sure. You have to have departed your country by a certain date and enter in, and this will be like granted for certain situations where there's a mass wave, where you can't get things through another way. So you can be granted humanitarian parole, able to enter before all the refugee processing, and be granted some things. However, if that's the case, there is no current path towards trying to become a legal resident if you are under that designation. So, and you're only, you're given a 90-day work authorization. And really you're just like, you're allowed to enter our country for 90 days, and then you need to figure something else out. So right now there's actually a bipartisan bill up in Congress, or moving through that process, called the Welcomed Act, that stands for some elaborate, meaningful acronym. And that is trying to extend that and give folks who are under that designation access to the healthcare, education, and work authorization that refugees can access. And so trying to pull into that umbrella folks that are being permitted to enter more quickly, because we know there's this humanitarian specific crisis going on.
Does that only apply to the Afghanistan situation?
It's an existing designation, and so they're using that designation in this Afghan situation. And then the Welcomed Act, I believe, is specific to Afghan allies. But you have to remember, so there's been a lot of talk about the special immigrant visa. So let's see, like that would help American affiliated Afghans that their service put them and their families at risk for anti-American violence. And because of the backlogs, they're trying to really move this through more swiftly because of the moral responsibility and ethical responsibility that a lot of people feel across all political affiliations that we have in this scenario because of our involvement in occupying and being at war in Afghanistan for 20 years. So in this event, evacuees could be relocated to the US or American territories. And that's actually just a few hundred people who, or I'm worried that my number is not right. Yeah, 700 SIV applicants currently and their family members who at the point of August 10th had been allowed through that designation. And we know that there are like 300,000 people who are trying to flee, or at one point I saw that number. It's constantly changing. So you have to keep in mind also that it's not just translators and interpreters who are at great risk, but all those other things or affiliations or people who are working to advance gender rights or expand education or journalists or all these other people who would fit under what we consider refugees and folks trying to flee. So basically there's a lot of red tape and a lot of policies that make a very big, complicated puzzle. Questions about any of that? And if you're online, please type your question in the chat and Kathy will help make sure that gets shared here.
So this is Kathy speaking, folks. I have a friend who she lives over here in Broomfield, and she shared that her sister in Chicago is trying to do some fundraising. There's women in Afghanistan who went to leadership camps, and now they're even a target as well. So I thought that would be a good example. So the gal in Chicago, she was actually able to get some news coverage about her endeavor to try to help these families get out. And so there's so many, we can't even probably imagine all of the different scenarios of people that are needing to go.
Right. And even if you weren't directly connected somehow with the US, with the change in what is expected in terms of how the Taliban will be running the country, you know, puts people in other forms of danger, whether or not they're affiliated with the US or not, right? And you're losing your democratic rights and things like that. So, and this is one example of crises that are constantly going on around the world all the time. We have a spotlight on this one because it's so interconnected with the immediate situation of the US withdrawing from Afghanistan. And the US has our handprints all over other parts of the world where we have supported policies or backed puppet governments or done all sorts of things that then have created crises in other countries and allowed for them, or not allowed, have helped create problems that then people need to flee from. I'm going to go a little bit more into, oh yeah, tell us.
Mary says, you mentioned the parole status. Do you know what options a person might have after 90 days? That's not a lot of time.
Right, yes, I agree with you. Let me see what I had on that. Oh, and by the way, the SIV status typically takes 3 years to process. So although there's some backlash on Biden, like that you didn't process these fast enough this spring, knowing you were going to withdraw, know that the comparative timeline is already typically 3 years. So to ask someone to process it in 3 months is also quite the comparison to the typical timeline. Well, and timeline's delayed because of COVID, but also because of the last 4 years previously. So typically in the US, we have a history of admitting refugees, and we have a refugee, oh, sorry, Mary's question. I don't know, Mary. It's like really complicated, and basically, and you can go, and in my research, you can go onto the US government websites and find like, this is the bureaucratic process if you're trying to apply for humanitarian parole. This is the form you need to send here. And imagine like if you or someone you know has applied for Social Security, for example, or if you or someone you know has changed your name, like, or even going to the DMV, like think about the type of process experience we might have experience with, and then magnify that a lot of times. And imagine that folks are trying to do this in a wide range of languages. So how that process can be very, very burdensome on people who are traumatized and fleeing their countries, often with just the clothes on their back. So a little bit more about like the history of refugee acceptance in the United States. Looking back to let me see. I believe it was 1980 or 1985, excuse me, and it's in here somewhere. That's when the refugee resettlement program in the United States officially started. And at that time, we were permitting, here it is, in 1980, we were permitting about 230,000 refugees per year into our country. And that cap is set by the president. So the president sets that number. It doesn't mean necessarily that many people are processed every year, but that's the ceiling. That then dropped, and we saw between the 80s all the way through to 2016, we fluctuated sometimes above 100,000, but really 85,000 at least was our cap. And then we saw that being chipped away at very steadily during the Trump administration. And so in those 4 years, each time that cap was brought down. So first Trump lowered it to 50,000 from 80,000, and then to from 85,000, and then set the 2021 cap at 15,000 people. And when that process was happening, the entire government structure that processes all of this stuff was also contracting. So then Biden on the campaign trail made promises to raise it to over 100,000, and in May had announced he was not going to do that and was going to keep it temporarily at 15,000. There was a huge backlash. And then he relented and moved it to 62,500 people. So still 20,000 lower than at the end of the Obama administration. And the structure is gutted. So even if we have that cap, we don't have in place the personnel and the departments to actually keep up with the demand. So I believe as of, let me double check my information, but as of In the first 7 months of 2021, despite now the cap being set at 62.5, we have had only admitted 2,300 refugees. So even though the cap has been raised, we're not able to accept people at a rate to come anywhere close to that. And so that's like the reality of the situation. Which means that organizations like Lutheran Family Services, LIRS, and other ones are critically important, and you will see their names in news articles about resettling Afghan allies in the States, because they're having to take on a load of that work, which comes into play with how we can support these things. Those organizations are the ones to take their lead and follow and see what they're asking for, because they have been experts in this field for decades and decades, and because the government structures don't have the capacity to support the need that there is. I'll stop again for questions or comments or wonderings of things you've heard in the news, or you're like, maybe I heard about this, but can you elaborate on that? Let me know.
Anne Marie has shared nonprofit immigration placement and assistant organizations like LIRS were gutted during the Trump administration. These organizations get government funding plus donations to help settle refugees and asylees. Funding essentially disappeared and workers were laid off. It will take some time to rebuild all the different refugee assistance and placement organizations.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna pause and just give you a chance. I'm gonna mute these mics, and Kathy, if you want, you can ask folks online, you can come off your own mutes, and she'll move a little bit away so that you're not interfering with sound. But, and you guys can have your conversation here amongst us, but talk a little bit about what kind of is resonating for you, what's spinning in your mind now that I've shared a little bit of this, or just kind of have some time to process some of this information or wonder things together about both the Afghan situation and current events, and just how do we live out this call as a community, as a community of faith, to welcoming people, and how you see that connect. So just basically take some processing time in an online group and in an in-person group to manage some of this information that's been flying at you. We'll take five.
Hello.
Hi, Mary.
Hey, Joel.
Hi, Mary, Joel,
Yeah,
Anne Marie.
hey.
Hi, everybody.
I'm going to start my video.
Can you guys hear me as well?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah, we can
Okay.
hear you.
I'd
Very
love
good.
it.
see in the
Hey,
dark.
hey, can you, before we start, can you tell us in 1 minute, Ingrid, where did your family come from?
So they were in Germany, but before the war, they were born in the Ukraine, but they were German. And so when they came back to Germany, in 1945, there was no place for them to go. So that's why they applied to the United States to become refugees.
Wow. And is it George's family that's Jewish, or was your family Jewish?
George's family is Jewish.
Okay.
So they were in
I was
Poland.
wondering.
Yeah.
You got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But a different situation. Thank you. I'm glad they came here. Where in South Dakota?
Oh, I don't remember now.
Do you know?
No.
Let's say it was my home church. We sponsored your family. Yeah.
Maybe.
I'm taking credit, even though I didn't in 1945.
It was 1951. They waited 5 years.
So what are you thinking about this, you guys?
You know, my gut feeling is that not a lot of people are talking about it. I think people are so overwhelmed with so many things here. I'm thrilled to see as many people. I think we have about 5 or 6 people in the sanctuary, along with myself and Marissa. So I was thrilled to see that, knowing we hadn't promoted it all that much, and people have busy lives. But outside of here, I haven't heard anyone even talking about, you know, the Afghan one specifically, since we're leaving there and causing all of that chaos that comes with us leaving the war component of it. How about you guys? Have you heard others discussing it?
Yeah, it came up at work. We have some people at my employer that are immigrants, like are on visas. So immigration is a pretty common topic at work.
Okay, good.
I did 2 things. One, I haven't heard a lot of people talking about it. I've heard it more just from reading or the news. But today on NPR, I heard that they did a study, and if somebody else heard it, correct me if I'm not right, but they're amazed that this is really a nonpartisan issue, that there's major support both between Republicans and Democrats for the Afghans coming here to the United States specifically as refugees, even if they were upset about border crossings, mainly because they recognize how many of these people, for the most part, really contributed to helping the United States in the war. Now, we know it's a lot more than that, but I'll take however anybody will accept people. That's great.
Agree. I hadn't heard that story, so that's great to hear that it's, that doesn't have anything to do with politics and people are pleased.
Yeah. I guess what I'd like to know is how do they decide, like, who decides that they go through a South Dakota church? Do we literally need to say, I want to help? Or are they assigned to different states? I mean, how does that happen? Anne Marie, hi, you might know that.
I barely know it, and I don't believe individual churches sponsor anymore, but there's settlement agencies. So there's 3 in Denver, for example. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services is one of them. There's a African one, and I forget the third one. And I think it's just hodgepodge. The government assigns this group to Denver, and then within Denver, they provide some funding, and that's a big deal. The government provides some funding to the different placement agencies, X dollars per refugee assigned to your agency. But that's where churches can step up, because like LIRS gets 10 families, and the government gives a really minimum amount of money to the family to help them get settled. And LIRS gives them additional money that they get from donors. And then they look for volunteers in the community, and especially within, their first reach out is to Lutheran churches, but they'll take anyone to come and help with mentoring the family, helping families figure out, teaching them a bus schedule and how things work. So there's a lot of assistance that can be provided, but I don't think individual churches are doing much individual sponsoring through directly with the government anymore.
Yeah,
So
one of the things
this
discussion made me wonder about is like where the bottleneck is. So if only 2,500 people are getting through, I mean, there's more than 2,500 churches in Texas alone, probably. Like it doesn't seem like it seems like there's some sort of limit somewhere. Is it in the amount of applications that can be processed?
before they're admitted to the country, if they're refugees, they have to get vetted that they aren't actually terrorists or things like that. So that it's the bottleneck is with the government. And what Marissa said is really true, that the government has been downsizing and decreasing funding for the State Department for doing all. It's not just the State Department, but there are different government organizations that would do the paperwork. Their staffing has been decimated. So it's the government has to approve someone to enter first, and then the refugee organizations, the volunteer organizations, they'll handle whatever they're given.
So these planes of people that have been coming out of Afghanistan, they're just in refugee camps, say in Turkey and other places, until they might have a flight over here?
I can't say for sure that I know about the Afghan ones. I think a lot of them are coming to the U.S. right now. So some of them are going to be processed after the fact, which is a little unnerving for some of the placement organizations. But some of them are going to be they're being housed on army bases and controlled environments where they're not free to go out in the community. Here's where you got to stay until we do your paperwork, which might take months.
Or maybe longer, huh?
Interestingly, while they're on a, in U.S. control, government control, they will have to get fed and clothed and have heat and things like that. Once they come as through like Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, it's sink or swim. They really have literally approximately 3-4 months of rent that's provided, and then they got to be making it. So I feel like this gives them a little additional transition time, which is possibly beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I tried to put myself in those footprints, and just think of the anxiety that they would be experiencing every day. To talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome, and just the unknowns for so long.
Okay, so that's something else I'm really excited to tell you then. When you donate money to LIRS for refugees, they have to provide basics, and some of that funding is provided by the government, but the extra money can pay for things. They have trauma counselors. They will do trauma counseling for the refugees that they process through their center. I can't say for the other two organizations in Denver, except it's likely that they do, because everyone knows that's really needed. But that's wonderful.
It'll be interesting to see what we as a church can do. My brother's church just sponsored a refugee family, not from Afghanistan, but 2 months ago. It was the typical, they set up an entire apartment for them with everything from all the furniture for the particular family that they would need for their size family, to all the bedding and food and everything they needed to get that first start.
And then I'll definitely pull you in before I talk about action.
My dog says hello.
Right, but you're here, right, about the
Marissa is saying we can continue talking if we'd like, and that we don't need to interrupt, or we can go back. They're still just having some conversation as well.
Okay. Well, I don't know. So I'll keep talking because I have things to say about this.
Well, I'd almost like to put you on the microphone. Could I do that?
I don't know, but I don't know if that's necessary. But I wanted to say that it was a few years ago that CTS had the LIRS truck, and we collected a whole bunch of household items for them, and that was a huge success and great involvement. And then for people who don't know, and everyone that I can see right now, CTS participates at Christmas time. It's gifts for first-year refugees, and we have a Christmas tree with tags on it. And some of it is for some sweet things like soccer balls, but there's a lot of winter jacket requests and blankets and rice cookers. So we'll be doing that again this year. And I hope that there's a lot of requests, and I think that there'll be a lot of people happy to help meet those needs. Because CTS always comes through. That's the thing.
Right. One thing I wanted to share with these guys, Anne Marie, I was mentioning the trauma of people getting placed places and then getting relocated here and then still having to figure out everything and about the trauma. And so Lutheran Family Services, Anne Marie confirmed, does provide counseling. So we don't know about the other 3 organizations that had been referenced, but
There's 3 total, two besides LARS.
yep, exactly. Are they ready? I think we will. Okay. I think we're going to have you guys join back, okay? Talk soon.
All right. Cool. Yeah. Oh. Now? Yes, awesome. So we were just sharing some more information to understand refugee populations in the United States. We talked about the top 5 states where folks are resettled once they get to the US, and that's Texas, California, New York, and Michigan are really the top 4, and then there's a number tied for number 5. And then we were speculating around where are the top locations people are coming from. And we had some guesses around like the region of Central America, Venezuela. Did we have further guesses? If you have guesses, type those in the chat. But yeah, did we have another idea? No? All right. Any guesses coming through, Kathy? It's not a test. Okay. And if it were, you should not look up the answer. So if we look at the year 2020, the top countries include the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, and the Ukraine. Each have over close to 2,000 or more refugees who have resettled just in 2020 from those places. And then other countries include Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Eritrea, and El Salvador. And so in total, the fiscal year 2020, we only processed 11,800 refugees. So even though the cap was very low compared to our history, we still did not even come close to meeting that cap at that time. Compare that to 2010, and the top countries were Iraq, Myanmar, Bhutan, Somalia, and Cuba, all who had, so Iraq and Myanmar had 18,000 and 16,000 folks who resettled in that year. And then Bhutan was over 12,000. Somalia and Cuba were over 4,000 people. And Iran and the Democratic Republic of Congo were over 3,000 people, and then the list goes on. So you can see that was 73,000 folks in 2010 that were accepted, processed, and resettled in the United States. So it's dropped off not just the cap, but the acceptance and processing of folks. We mentioned in our group Central America because we hear a lot about Central Americans who are fleeing their countries, violence and corrupt political situations, and coming up, migrating with desperation, sending children alone through and trying to enter at the southern border. There had been for quite a while refugee camps, and recently those were dismantled. And so there's not even a refugee waiting spot there anymore. However, if we look at Latin American refugees, that has been consistently low compared to other areas of the world. And so if we think about how the need and desperation of people in different places compares to what's politically advantageous and popular to be able to support accepting, those are really different things. So I said, I'm the daughter of Cuban refugees. Cubans have made up 75% of accepted Latin American refugees. Because, and I say this standing in my privilege, knowing that I am the daughter of a refugee, it's still, the trauma, the mentality is still affecting my family. My grandmother just had a series of strokes, and in leaving the hospital, still has this mindset of like scarcity and poverty. Didn't pay for an Uber and instead rode a bus for 3 hours to get home because it's just, she's over 90 years old and it's this mindset. Sorry, Abuela, if you're watching. So even in that situation, right, 75% of all of Latin America and the Caribbean that we have accepted in the last about 20 years, last 10 years since 2010 have been Cuban refugees. And our crisis was, I mean, it's still very dire, but started in 1959. And that's because of our relationship with communism as a country and what was politically acceptable and advantageous, and our fight for democratic countries around the world. And so it's an easy sell to have let my family and our people into this country in a way that is different than the way people talk about Central American migrants fleeing desperately. And the honest truth about the American government's involvement in many of those countries that have led to that situation. So we have to always bear in mind, it's easy to see with the current crisis in Afghanistan how people talk about like we have a moral obligation to step up and help, and that's often obscured in other situations for which that also holds true. If you want any more details, especially about Latin America, that is something I actually studied in college. So if you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, I'd love to learn more, you can ask me for that, and I'm happy to point you to resources around that. So any other just curiosities about refugee facts before I move to action items, which I know everybody is definitely interested in hearing? Great. All right. Like I said, I'll follow up with an email with some resources, and as well as some of my core sources I pulled from that included the UN High Commission for Refugees, because this is an international designation. And so, all right, action things that you can do. We have talked a bit about LIRS as well as Lutheran Family Services. And so those are two Lutheran organizations that our community has continuous support with. The LIRS website has lots of information for you to learn from, as well as they have a take action section. And so you can, through their website, there's information about current top priorities and urgent needs, which is right now helping resettle Afghan allies. And then there are 3 other core areas, which is advocate and taking policy actions. Things like I just sent a thing to my representatives about supporting the Welcomed Act that we talked about that would grant more supports for folks under that humanitarian parole designation that they otherwise couldn't access, and to extend it past just 90 days to be more realistic in terms of what people need. So you can always go there to find things. Sometimes it's not very like shiny and glittery to do the advocacy work. However, if we only are responding with charity and immediate need, which is also really important, the rice cooker, very legitimate immediate use to a real human. But if we're only doing that side and not thinking about the policy, we talked a lot tonight about all those bureaucratic things that tie people up for years. And if you know anything about refugee camps, those are not a safe place. And they're especially unsafe for children and women and the LGBTQ community who are extremely vulnerable to violence. And people might live there for decades, waiting for processing. So even if it doesn't feel shiny to like help fill out a form letter to a representative, those things are really, really critical to make big change that affects a lot of people. Volunteering, they do have a set of ways you can volunteer. One positive outcome of the pandemic is that a lot of times our physical location has fewer barriers than it did 2 years ago. And obviously donating, and like Anne Marie's point, you know, these organizations that are doing this work, that's a really important place to donate. Lutheran Family Services we talked about, and they have that Rocky Mountain space. There's also Colorado Refugee Connect. And again, I'll send all these links if you've given me your email address. And then specific local means to respond. There is a mosque in Denver. I don't speak Arabic, but it's Masjid Ikhlas Mosque in Metro Denver, and they are collecting supplies and funds. And I will include that link as well. I think it's 2 days a week, maybe once a Saturday and once a weekday, Wednesdays maybe, where they are having like drive through and drop things off. You can also donate online. And they might, if not them, I have another, I think it's through, I have another refugee needs list that you can do through Amazon, where they have an Amazon wish list through one of these organizations that you can move through that to get the things, the items that are really useful for people as they resettle. And then we have been seeing, and I'll share these articles, like there was one in the Times Call, our local Boulder paper, about how to support any folks who might be resettling directly in our area. So while we're not at the top of the list of places that might be receiving refugees, our community has expressed to the federal government that we are open and willing to accept people, and we anticipate that people will be resettled here. We just don't know how many, and of course, as we've discussed, the timeline is unknown, which is another reason to stay connected and engaged, because we don't want it to be a flash in the pan. The needs are ongoing. And there were some interesting things through there where, I mean, physically hosting and providing housing for someone who's resettling or their family, tutoring, mentoring in terms of career mentorship, because if you are accepted as a refugee, you do have legal permission to work. And so that's a major transition for somebody. And having a mentor in that capacity that could help guide people is really important. Tutoring, as we've discussed, can be children, but also adults, can be English, oftentimes is helping people with English. And then another key organization that we have had connection with and that has a bit more personal touch to it is an organization called Casa de Paz. And as a follow-up to tonight's session of learning, you're all invited, and tell other folks too, to come back and meet in person. We'll do an outside gathering, weather permitting, on October 3rd. So about a month away, where we can have, as a community of people who are interested in engaging and supporting folks, kind of an accountability partnership. So you might, right, we might hear more about Lou. She went through the training on Tuesday, and how's that progressing for her? Or what did she learn in her training that we could learn from her? I am committing to finishing the online training for Casa de Paz. That organization isn't specific to refugees and asylum seekers only. It's more widely immigrants who are currently detained at the ICE facility in Aurora, many of whom are refugees and asylum seekers. Oftentimes we have a connection with detention facilities as a, they're physically similar to a prison, but people there are not criminals. There, a lot of the people there don't have legal representation to help them with all of this processing that has to happen. Or if the processing is so complex, if you miss one minute thing, then technically you've committed a crime and can be put into the detention center. Or some folks who have legal status and are going in for their check-ins that are legally required, then have been taken at their check-in that they're showing up to, fulfilling their end of the commitment and being put into detention facilities. Folks can be there for months to years. So they are an organization that's non-political, that is committed to accompaniment and hospitality. They have a huge range of ways to get involved. So because I have small children and trying to figure out how to physically be present has been honestly a battle for 3 years while I've been trying to get connected with this organization, I'm going to finish my online training and I'm going to become a pen pal. And I'm going to write to someone or multiple someones who are in detention right now. And that's the path that I'm going to choose. They also need drivers where you pick people up and take them to the airport. So the organization facilitates getting in contact with your family when you're released and helping you make those travel arrangements and getting you there. Every day, I believe it's typically, though this summer was an anomaly, typically people are released around 6 o'clock. They have a van, so they need someone to be the van host and sit outside the detention center. And they've like revamped it to kind of be, have couch seating in there while you wait as people get released each day. Then you hang out. You're just showing human contact and welcome in a way that folks haven't experienced for possibly years inside detention. Then you help them get to the casa, and they're actually just moving this past weekend or right now. Yes, they bought a house now. So they're not just out of an apartment into a house, but now a purchased home. So then you take folks to there and they need someone to be the host at the house and they need other people to drop off dinner so that you host and you have community dinner. Can you imagine that feeling? And then helping people with translation or helping people, they even accept like your airline miles to help buy tickets for people to reunify with their families wherever they are in the States. Because oftentimes, I'm like sucking air through this mess. Oftentimes, people are relocated. They may have gotten picked up in one location and then are bounced around to completely different states and are trying to get back to their family in New York or in Pennsylvania or wherever. The system. So there's a million ways. They used to do pre-pandemic, and I assume they will continue at some point, in-person visits. You can also drop off snacks, but you can make a home-cooked dinner and take that, if that's something, a way of caring, or you can be present for people and just talk and be connected. So that's one of the big, like really possible human touch organizations and recommendations that I have in our local community. So again, I will send an email with lots of links and information. I'll organize it. And then I invite you to make your own personal commitment of action that feels like a right step for you, and to join us and invite other people to join us on October 3rd. That'll be after both worship services at 10:15. And like I said, I'm going to try to do it outside with pop-up tents for shade, hoping for good weather conditions. But we'll do it inside if necessary, and just mask in the larger classroom down the hall. Again, I'm going to commit to doing that online training and having it done by October 3rd. And I'm also working on getting a volunteer from Casa de Paz to come and share their experience. So thank you so much for your time tonight. Please contact me with inquiries or questions, and I will definitely be reaching out probably the beginning of next week. Tomorrow's my day